All right, let's continue to explore some of these themes, and we're now joined by Chris Nash, who's the director and co-founder of the European Network on Statelessness. He's worked in the refugee, migration and human rights field for over 20 years now, initially as an asylum lawyer and then at several national and international NGOs, including Amnesty International. The European Network on Statelessness, ENS, is a civil society alliance of over 150 organisations and individual experts in 41 countries committed to addressing statelessness in Europe. And the article contribution looks at what needs to be done in Europe to ensure that everyone can realise their right to a nationality. So, Chris Nash, thanks so much indeed for joining us. It's almost difficult to believe that in a developed part of the world like Europe, there would be people who are stateless. Let's hear from you.
Sure, and yes, I mean, Europe often likes to see itself as a model of democracy and human rights, but it's actually home to a surprising number of stateless people, like you said, at least 500,000 in total, many born in Europe itself, but also more recent arrivals. And by any yardstick, the countries of Europe must do more to solve this very solvable issue. And the reason I say that is because an international legal framework guaranteeing protection to stateless people and setting clear rules for preventing statelessness has been in place for at least a generation. So if all state signatories had translated this into effective national law, the problem would have been eradicated by now. But I guess identity politics, migration debates, and questions about who does and doesn't belong have got in the way of this. So while some progress has been made in recent years, and it's important to acknowledge that, much more needs to be done, and quickly. Firstly, half of all European states do not have full safeguards in their nationality laws to grant children born on their territory nationality if they would otherwise be stateless. And this gap is leaving thousands of children to continue to grow up stateless. Secondly, shockingly in my view, only 12 European states have established dedicated procedures to identify who on their territory is stateless and owed protection under international law. And this leaves many stateless people in legal limbo with no way to regularise their stay, but equally nowhere to go, and often at risk of detention and destitution. And thirdly, to pick up on the previous interview, we know that many thousands of those forcibly displaced to Europe every year are stateless, but asylum law and policy too often fails to adequately address their particular protection needs. Countries across Europe could fix this if they showed sufficient political will and put in place laws and policies that implement their obligations under international law. At ENS, we've actually established a statelessness index with comparative information on 24 countries showing exactly what needs to change. And as a civil society alliance with over 150 members in 41 countries, we stand alongside stateless people in demanding reform, and we also stand ready to work with governments and other actors to help achieve this.
So, Chris, I mean, is it just political will? I mean, you know, when I look at Europe and the European Union, for example, there's a whole bunch of rules that everyone needs to abide by. How do stateless people slip through the net?
It's a good question. And I mean, although state-led initiatives are, clearly important, to date, these have proved inadequate and sporadic. And therefore urgent attention by regional bodies such as the EU and the Council of Europe is now required to catalyse reform and end statelessness. So despite the fact that there were landmark European Council conclusions in 2015 and rallying cries from the European Parliament, Europe as a region still lacks a common approach to statelessness akin to regional strategies adopted in the Americas and West Africa. The next phase of UNHCR's I Belong campaign will continue to galvanise action, but ending statelessness in Europe would take longer than 4 years, and it will require new coalitions with people affected and an ever closer monitoring of law, policy and practice to hold governments to account. Put simply, this is an issue Europe cannot continue to ignore if it is up to uphold its long-standing values of freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law and human rights. Hopefully, today's launch of the Statelessness in Atlas will add impetus towards achieving that.
Yeah. In your article, you state that stateless people themselves are often not involved in the debate, and that state-led initiatives, though welcome, are not enough. And I just wonder, how could stateless people be more involved in the debate, and what initiatives beyond government initiatives are needed to overcome statelessness in Europe?
Yes, so I mean, I think that's a really important point, and it's vital to emphasize that stateless people don't fall into a single category, but rather we need to recognize their diverse individual and myriad identities. They are of different genders, ages, sexual orientation, socioeconomic backgrounds, abilities, languages, religions, and ethnicities. Stateless people have their own agency and voice, and they must be heard as part of the decision-making processes that affect their lives, whether that's at a local, national, or global level. Ultimately, statelessness can only be effectively addressed, I think, if the multiple identities and experiences of those directly affected by it are taken into account, and also that the links between statelessness and racism, patriarchy, and other forms of oppression are properly understood.
All right, so the Atlas of the Stateless is the beginning, I guess, of a lot of work that's required on statelessness. What else do you think we should be focusing on in the future work, particularly around statelessness in Europe?
Yeah, well, firstly, just to say how welcome it is to have a high-profile global change maker such as the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation take up the issue of statelessness and help to shine a spotlight on it, given that historically it was so ignored. Increasing awareness and understanding about the problem is, of course, an essential precursor to solving it. And I guess one thing that Rosa Luxemburg can do is to help ensure that stateless people themselves continue to have a platform and are directly heard in the debate. For example, by asking them to contribute articles to key publications such as the Atlas, to speak at events like the one here today, and more broadly to help shape our collective calls for reform. But I guess secondly, as a grant-making body, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has the opportunity to directly support civil society efforts to address statelessness in Europe and globally, which is particularly important, I think, given that currently relatively few donors are sensitized to the issue or fully recognize its nexus with issues such as forced migration, child rights, and anti-discrimination. At ENS, we're actually very grateful for funding we are currently receiving from Rosa Luxemburg to support research we're doing looking at the nexus between statelessness and access to health rights, particularly in the context of the current pandemic. But it's also important to highlight a funding gap that currently exists for many grassroots and community-led organizations working on the ground, who often find themselves ineligible or unable to access even the limited funding streams that are currently available. So anything that Rosa Luxemburg can help to fill this gap would be hugely valuable, as ultimately we can't end statelessness without the people directly affected by it.
All right, Chris Nash, very important points. Thanks very much indeed for coming through. Thanks for your article and the work that you continue to do at the European Network on Statelessness. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you.
All right.